So I want to welcome everyone to another Dean's Lecture here at Auburn Theological Seminary, where we identify and equip leaders to build community, bridge divides, pursue justice, and heal the world. We have been doing this work for 10 generations. That's over 200 years. And I'm grateful. I'm Patrick Reyes. I'm grateful to be here as the Dean, Executive Vice President, and sitting with Kaitlin Curtice. Before we get to the conversation with her about her amazing book, Everything is a Story, that just was released, I want to tell you a little bit about the Dean's Lectures. I'll invite you into a brief practice, and then we'll jump into the conversation. After we have the conversation, I'll be curating questions in the chat. So go ahead as you're hearing the conversation, drop your questions throughout the gathering in the chat. So Dean's Lectures are about healing. That's what Auburn's up to in the Center for Storytelling and Narrative Change. We care very deeply about healing the wide divides that we have in our society. We have a long history of bringing the world's best storytellers, scholars, and leaders to share what work they're doing. Past lectures have included Freddie Mutangua, who is at the Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, Phyllis Webstad, who is the founder of Orange Shirt Movement, for those who are familiar up in Canada, working with Indigenous and Indian boarding schools and healing on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Um, We've had folks from Roots who've been doing deep work in Gaza. Pulitzer Prize finalist, MacArthur Genius Grant winner, Tommy Orange kicked off this year's series. We've had Lynn Cooper, Tufts chaplain, who, if y'all remember in the spring when ICE was doing their, just kind of previewing their stuff, had just come onto their campus, and she talked about what does it mean to build friendships across divides in that moment. We had Julian Brave Noisecat this summer, the filmmaker, Oscar-nominated filmmaker, and whose new book is out. We Survived the Night. I encourage you all to get that. And this fall, we've had Stephanie Crumpton, who talked to us about trauma. How do we heal from the deep trauma? And Lakeisha Lockhart, who led us through practices of play. So this approach to storytelling for us is about healing. And how do we do that through story? How do we connect with story, not just tell a better story, but actually share stories that heal the many divides? And today, I have the privilege to welcome one of my favorite authors on the planet, Kaitlin Curtice, who is an award-winning. Now, I wanted to say you have two trilogies, but you really have like four, and I don't know what a four is called, but a seasonal children's book, and now a trilogy of nonfiction. Yeah, you want go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Kaitlin? Oh, I got it. There you go.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I don't know at this point how it's all going, but the fourth children's book will be out next year, so then there will be four of them once we're done. But yeah, I've really enjoyed writing those too.
And we'll have spring, autumn, summer, and there is a winter book. But for anyone who doesn't like winter like me, I still encourage you to read it. It will
Yes.
keep you warm in winter. But award-winning author has been featured on Being, USA Today, and I'm grateful as my premier here. I see you holding your book. Can you show us all? Because if you registered, you would have gotten a copy of Everything is a Story, or it will be in the mail to you. But we are
Yes.
grateful you're here. So we're going to open with a practice and then a question, and one will lead into the other. But we always try to start with a practice of grounding. And one of the things I love so much about your book, Kaitlin, is that you give us this vision of an oak tree. That the way that we tell stories and share stories really comes from the wisdom and the insights that we can glean from starting like a acorn. We're going to ask a question about that acorn. But right now, I want to ask the folks who are in the room if you could drop in the chat. Um, think about what story was seeded, or what story are you seeding in this world? What are you trying to grow? What story right now is just an acorn that you are trying to grow? Go ahead and drop that in the chat. Take some time to think about that. And it's going to lead us into our first question here. And Kaitlin, the framework you provide us with this oak tree, and you trace its life cycle throughout this book, which I absolutely love. But you start with an acorn, and not just like, hey, we're seeding something. Here's a nice vision of a seed. You actually say the shape of the seed matters and leads us into some frameworks around liminality, loving, lethal stories. Can you walk us through just how the shape of an acorn can lead us into better stories and the type of stories that you're trying to lead us into.
Yeah. Um, as I do that, I want to open with a poem from the very beginning of the book because I feel like it's gonna just speak to everything that we are talking about and how stories take shape and how we even understand the stories told to ourselves about ourselves. So I want to read that and then get into it, if that's okay. Who first told you the story of yourself? Who decided how you'd be raised, where, why, and when? Who made you think certain things of that holy body, exceptional mind, and thoughtful heart? Who held the power to shape your everything? On what day did you decide to revisit the story? At what time did you discover that it was all too much and not enough? Where were you when you promised to love that body, mind, and heart again? Who helped you find your way home to yourself? Who gave you pen and paper to write the story as it always should have been? Tell me the story again, and we will grieve what's been lost and rewrite the next chapter, and the next, and the next, and every moment that follows for ourselves, for each other, and for every story yet to be imagined. So, bonjour everyone. Kaitlin Curtice and Dejnakas Potawatomi and Dow. My name is Kaitlin Curtice. I'm a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. And even in saying that greeting in Potawatomi is a way for me to hold and honor parts of my story that have not always been held to the forefront for me. And you know, following the life cycle of a story through the life cycle of an oak tree. I have this little bowl of acorns in my office that I keep. One of them's a glass acorn, and then the others are, I love this one because it's actually bursting open. The seeds are in it. Like you can see them in it. And others are fully capped as they are. Others are little babies. And this one just when I had brought it home and seeing that it was actually bursting and the seeds are in it, it was such a beautiful moment for me of holding that. It was just like a week or two ago and realizing I'm seeing inside that acorn what is possible. And acorns provide us that incredible imagery. And when I realized I wanted to follow the life cycle of a story through the life cycle of an oak tree, I was just crossing my fingers that it would work, that it would make sense. And I was so excited about that possibility because the oak tree is such a universal symbol of strength and resilience and care and sheltering and um, a tool in so many ways as well. And so to focus on this little acorn, that idea of the seed being so capable of so much just seemed like a perfect way for the life of a story to also begin. Um, and I was reading so many books about just oaks and acorns as well, doing that research to see if any of the science sort of connected. So I was really excited when I realized like, oh, acorns, which we know this, acorns show up in different shapes. Some of them are really long, some of them are really short and stout, some of them are, the caps are kind of crooked on their heads. Some are, like there's so many, some of them have stripes on them. Their bodies and how they show up in the world are so varied, and yet they all show up as they are. And I thought that's a beautiful metaphor for who we are. And stories can show up in different ways as well. They can be linear, they can be cyclical. They can, come at us from different angles and show up differently in the world. And that's so powerful as well and shows what they're capable of. So to me, it fit perfectly. And I had to keep going beyond that and give us like ways to sort of categorize stories. Labels are helpful only to a certain extent, but they are helpful and categories are helpful for us as humans. So I was trying to figure out a way for us to look at that. So I sort of created these three categories of loving, lethal, and liminal. That when we come in contact with a story, can we kind of just look at them and see who they are and how they show up in the world? So that's a bit about sort of the shape that stories take. And it's important for us, even from a young age, to sort of examine how those stories are showing up.
I mean, when you were doing that, the shape, I mean, you led into the types of stories that it leads into, like the types of storytelling that we do, and each one having a impact. And you give these the liminal, the loving, the lethal. Can you walk us a little bit through around how you saw those stories kind of playing out, and for those of us who are storytellers, why we need to be paying attention to the types of stories we're seeding?
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to help us, you know, when we're scrolling social media, when we're in the news, when we're reading a book, when we're out participating in society, when we're at home just by ourselves, and we come across a story, um, can we engage with it in a deeper way? So can we ask, is this story loving? Is it producing love in the world? Is it producing care and solidarity and compassion? The things that are what love is, kinship. Is this a lethal story? Is it a story that brings harm and pain and oppression, genocide, war, death? We can name those stories too. But then there are also liminal stories, and the liminal ones, I love liminality. I have the liminality journal and I write on liminality. And if we're honest as humans, a lot of the stories we encounter are liminal, as in they're not quite done yet, or we're in the middle of them, but we don't know the answer, or, you know, we don't quite see the clear picture yet, or we're just not sure. We're asking a lot of questions. And I want us to be okay with that, that there are a lot of the stories that we are in the middle of that we don't know what the outcome will be. And even for us to be aware of that is I think a really important act of resistance in our world, that if we're at least aware of the story that we're inside of. Like for instance, right now where we are as a nation, we're in the middle of this story. And there's aspects of love, there's a lot of lethal aspects to these stories, and we're living in the liminal space of all of that, and we're trying to hold that space, and we're trying to make sense of things, and in a lot of ways we don't have answers yet, but we have dreams and imagination and what we hope to create in the future, and we are holding on to community. Like that is where the liminal stories show up, and I think they have so much possibility for us, to remind us of who we are. So I hope that the book gives people the courage and the tools to kind of work through that and notice some of these stories that they're telling or participating in or that have been told to them.
I love that notion of liminality. We'll stick with it just briefly because when I was reading that section, I also happened to be watching My Neighbor Totoro like up on the screen and thinking about the liminality of them finding the acorn, growing the big tree, having imaginative friends. And what I love that you open up at the very beginning of the book is in that idea of liminality, we're also not searching for good guys and bad guys or a conflict that immediately needs to be resolved and making space for stories that are circular. I just love that notion. Share a little bit more about how do we tell liminal stories, because when at least when I'm in spaces, the idea is like, give us the story that's got the big wow or
Yeah.
big conflict, but these stories are much more complex and they're more human and I think more authentic to our lives. So help us as storytellers on this call think about how we tell better liminal stories.
Hmm. Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that recently because, I've struggled even with my own voice of being, am I too soft? Am I not loud enough? Am I not speaking in the right ways or showing up in the right ways? And coming to terms even with my own liminality, that the way that the kind of storyteller, the kind of poet that I am, and these like two embodiments sort of came to me a few years ago, that I feel gentle and fierce at the same time, that I can be soft and fierce, and those things that we often say are at odds with each other, could never go together, happen to be both existing inside of me all the time. So in the way that I embody my work in the world, I have to be true to that liminality that I hold, and that I am a poet and I approach things through story in an invitational way. And then I want us to get to the truth telling, and I want us to get to the work. That's personally how I show up in the world. But it took me a long time to be okay with that. I still struggle sometimes with being okay with that. Is it enough? Is it going to produce enough change in the world? And we all have to trust our own voices, and we have to trust the liminal ways we show up to this work. I think that if I were to talk to a group of storytellers, I would want them first to know that, like that the liminal spaces that we just inhabit in our own beings and our own bodies and our own stories is really important when we approach the stories out in the world. Because if we're not grounded in that, we're going to have a really hard time showing up. It's the same like, Richard Rohr talking about dualism and all of those ideas that if we are harshly looking constantly for right and wrong or black and white or whatever we're trying those dualities, we're going to have a hard time finding the complexity, the liminality, the spots where stories overlap. And if we're willing to show up in the world and ask questions and hold space, then stories are going to show up differently to us, and we're going to be able to have a different threshold for how to hold them, if that makes sense.
What I love about that is the holding of many stories. And one of the things where you give us a place to go to, libraries, which I love. We've never lived farther than we can walk to a library. And thinking about libraries or sanctuaries or cathedrals for the imagination where they're holding these, just people where the possible is. And you also give libraries are this place with stories, a sense of power. So you say libraries are scenes of power, showing us
Mm.
who has voice in a community. Tell us how you balance this idea of like we were just talking ahead of the call around the changing nature of stories and writing books and public funding for libraries and all that. But these public spaces where many stories are held and hold that power. How are stories? How are you seeing stories building towards power, and where are they currently? Are they still sitting in libraries, or is it public sphere calls with
Mm,
Auburn? How are you thinking about power and stories?
mm. That's a great question. Yeah, I encountered this a lot, I think, just as an author, and like what we were talking about, whose voices are getting heard, how do we do our work against and alongside algorithms, and what success means in the world, as an Indigenous author. Just this morning I posted a reel on Instagram that was the internal dialogues I often have with myself. And one of those is no one wants to read books by native authors. That's not, and then the other side is yes, they do, and they are. And that's coming more. I mean, to walk into libraries and in my local library, first of all, to see my own children's books there is incredible. But to look on shelves and see that they're not just the books about Native Americans written by anthropologists in the 1960s anymore, that there's fresh, beautiful, current children's books for our kids to read that is telling Indigenous stories from our own perspectives, from our own cultures and languages and stories is incredible. I know it can get so it can be so easy to feel so discouraged and terrified right now. But when I even on social media, when I look, I see the power of stories so beautifully being played out everywhere, especially among artists and creatives. The filmmakers of our time, the musicians, the sculptors and the painters and the writers and the poets, people who are showing up to their art in such gorgeous ways and naming these truths so loudly and boldly. um Beyond our library, like the coffee shop I go to rotates the art that's on the walls, and it's always so beautiful to see stories in that way. Or my climbing gym, they have art on their walls, and they do craft fairs where the community comes and we share our work. So just seeing the way that yes, the lethal stories will always have power, but also just keep looking for the loving stories as well, or the liminal ones, because they're there. And um, I started something recently on my Substack called the Solidarity Spotlight, just because I want to make sure that we keep seeing those stories, like that we keep seeing that there are films and there are albums being produced that are so breathtaking and give us life when we are terrified and when we are longing for the better stories, the ones that will lead us to kinship and imagination, that they are there and that we're not alone. I think that that is so important. And a library can remind us of that, but so too can Instagram every now and then. And our other places of gathering and places like this, we can remind each other, you're not alone. I see you. we're creating these things, we're helping people, keep engaging in their sacred imagination, and that matters.
I mean, that sacred imagination is something you also talk quite a bit about in the religious and spiritual storytelling that goes alongside this. So, in addition to like, stories being sites of power, like where we can build this, you talk about religion being, and I'm going to quote you here, micro and macro, and can bring tremendous change to families and communities around the world. But we have to hold that power carefully because culture is contagious, end quote. So tell us a little bit about sacred storytelling as not just holding just whatever story or going down to the dig, although those are sometimes great stories. I love that. But like holding these big sacred narratives and this idea of it's contagion or it's got cultural power, can move things. Talk to us about what does it mean to hold sacred stories?
Hmm. Well, I think of immediately our, oral storytelling tradition in a lot of indigenous cultures around the world throughout time that part of the power of storytelling is that when you speak a story into existence, it does become this living being that they move. You can imagine almost like, an elder sitting and telling a story with all of the kids gathered around that when the elder speaks that story, like something changes in the air, something is happening. Even if those kids have heard that story thousands of times before, there is something that's happening. It's like those kids are soaking up those stories. They're being embedded into their beings. And that is a beautiful thing because it helps us continue to exist and continue to hold. So we hold the sacredness of those stories in our bones, in our bodies, in our DNA. And I think that that is so beautiful. I my in my family, my grandparents were they didn't talk a lot about being Potawatomi because we have a lot of trauma in our family. So for me to reclaim those stories or to learn them in new ways, and to carry them now for me or to tell them to my children or when I go visit places or to write those stories is incredibly sacred for me. And to do it through poetry is incredibly sacred. Poetry is storytelling. And in my bio, I decided to put poet storyteller as a hyphenated word because I want people to see that the two go together. That at least in my poetry, I'm telling a story when I write a poem. And that is a sacred act of bringing these embodiments together and saying that they matter. So the ways that we carry stories, especially within our spiritual traditions, is huge. And I think it ripples out further than we realize. I think, I mean, we can see the ripple effects of Christian nationalism in America. We can see the cultural effects of something, those belief systems, those stories that we tell. But I've been reading again this Clarissa Pinkola says Women Who Run with the Wolves. You know, her work is just incredible on archetypes and myth and stories and the power of stories. So I keep thinking of the just the deep well and the undercurrent of what sacred stories do. We have a lot of the stories of pain and oppression and war and hate that rise to the surface. And I think that in the time we're living in, it's important for us to fall back down into the deep stories, the ones that have been moving and breathing for a really long time. Those are the sacred stories that hold us and tend to us in times like this. Those are the stories we need to hold on to. And not just for ourselves, but with each other in community. I think that that's where so much of our hope rests and flows in that sort of undercurrent.
That you lead into a conversation around the responsibility of the storyteller. So drawing on these wells
Mhm.
um, comes with a lot of responsibility and accountability, especially for those of us who represent communities as leaders. How do you go about choosing stories that you share with public? I mean, the thing I love about your writing, Kaitlin, is that it's so interwoven with personal story, narrative, stuff that's happening in the national sphere. Like it's such a beautiful invitation into your life, your inner life. But you have to make a choice around what stories you choose. How do you what tell us about your process in writing and choosing those stories?
For this book,
for all time.
or
This
for
book
anything.
you could do
For
this
all
book,
time.
and I need this advice. I think others on this call need it as well.
Oh
Like, how
yeah,
to
for
choose
sure.
the stories.
Um, yeah, that's a great question. I was talking at an event the other day about this because a woman was trying to decide which story to tell in a piece she was writing. And I was talking about how, first of all, in writing this book, it was really hard because I had to recognize that there were stories I wanted to write about that I just couldn't get into the book. You know, there were stories I wanted to be in the book and I was running out of time and words and I had to make choices. And that was really hard for me. Like I was like, can I get a part two? Because there's so many, that deserve to be told, and so I had to make those choices with, what personal stories do I want to tell? What collective stories do I want to tell? That's really hard. That was difficult for this book. I use the metaphor of sifting a lot as an author and a storyteller, that we, as writers, but also any creatives or artists, we are constantly encountering the world and pulling things in, ideas, energies, metaphors, like literal words that come into our brains all the time, or some sort of inspiration. And I think of just holding like a, what is it, a colander or like a sifter, and just constantly shaking, 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 and seeing what stays and what is not important for this moment, because there's so many things that we could and should be focusing on, and it's hard to decide. And I tell writers, even if say you're sifting and two stories rise to the top that you need to focus on, that you need to tell and give attention to, that doesn't mean the others are just lost forever, but maybe you'll write about them in 6 months or in a future book or for your Substack, or it will be a piece that you publish in collaboration with others. Like it's the same with editing. When our books get edited and chunks are taken out that we loved, put it in a file and put it somewhere else down the road. It doesn't disappear from who you are just because it's not in this moment being written about or being processed. And I think it's the same, that we are constantly sifting. So that's a spiritual practice. Literally, if you are a journaler, write down all the stories that you're working through, and take time to evaluate and choose, and then hold the others for a later time or for a moment when they're going to show up again. Because the power of those stories is you could have a story, there are stories I could have written about 5 years ago that just didn't feel ready yet. And then they show up again later and you're ready to write them. And I think that, or ready to hold them if it's someone else's story or if it's a story of connection. So we have to trust ourselves, trust that the stories and the words will show up as they need to, and that our work is that sort of sifting work of asking. It's kind of like asking, what is my lane? What's my gift? Ask what stories we need to invest in at this moment, which ones are speaking to us and asking us to invest in them. And then we go with it and let it lead us somewhere.
And you've been leading, at least me, as I was reading through this book, questions that we're holding at Auburn around healing. How do we heal? How do stories heal? And you have this way that you describe caring for stories, caring for generations and relationships, that you ask, what do we want for future generations? And
Mm.
the image you give us as a storyteller is a doula. What you're bringing into the world. Talk to us about what is a healing? How does healing happen through story?
Yeah. I thought of the doula because obviously we have birth doulas, we have death doulas, and we have the possibility to also be story doulas. Um, and I just thought that that was a really fascinating thing to think about, that we can be a partner to stories being born and growing in the world. And our responsibility is, I often think that our liminal life we live right now is this space between our ancestors and future generations. And so anything we do, any of the healing we do in our lifetime affects our ancestors. I think it ripples to them still. I believe that. But I also believe that it ripples to future generations. So all of the work we do now, all of the healing that we invest in, the stories we choose to tell, they are living beyond us in ways we will never understand, honestly. And that's a beautiful thing. And it also means that we have a responsibility to our own healing, to our private healing, our personal healing, and to our collective healing. That when we are being willing to dive into that work, it is having ripple effects larger than we can imagine. And I think that's something I hold a lot. And what is my reason for caring about the stories the way that I do? What is my reason for writing poetry or being an author? And a lot of that comes down to healing. That for me, books can heal people. Books can be a huge part of our healing. They can change our lives. One book can change a life, and that's a huge amount of power that words have, you know. And so I think that acknowledging that as writers, as creatives, acknowledging that our art is incredibly powerful and the stories we tell through that art is incredibly powerful, helps us be more honest about the work, helps us be more honest about how we show up to that healing. And, I believe that words are medicine. That's always how I view it. So even when I'm writing my books, if I'm not in a right place to write, I won't write. We kind of have that sentiment in ceremony in our tribe. If you're going to lead ceremony, make sure your heart's right, make sure your head's right, you're in a space to lead. I kind of feel that way when I write my books, that if I am showing up to my book one day and I know I'm not right, like that I need to go and spend some time with myself and figure things out, not to fix it, but to like show up in a different way to the work of healing. And I think we all owe that to one another and to ourselves, that we show up in that way and honor the power of our words and our stories.
I'll remind folks to drop. We're almost at the question part, so drop questions that you have. I'll start curating questions for this conversation. But as you think about, Kaitlin, the imagination of sitting down and preparing yourself for writing a ceremony, that I'm curious about that preparation work. That if you have a sacred story, many sacred stories that you're holding within you, um, how it's a solitary act.
Hmm.
You're imagining an audience, you're imagining a reader who's on the other end.
Yeah.
So there is like some sort of imagination connecting. There's connecting to spirit and the divine, all the ways that you could be imagining that writing process is relational.
Hmm.
But I love the intention you're giving to ceremony. That this is a sacred act that we're doing. I wonder what encouragement or um, insight you might give to some of us around how how we take that on as what I hear is vocation. Like this is not just work. I'm just going to pound out some words today. I really
Right.
need to think about my intentions of actually putting words to paper. Help us think about what does it mean to hold that sacredness or the responsibility in the way that you just described it.
Yeah. At least in my realm of writing, that definitely is true, in that it's not just work for work's sake, or it's not just editing just to edit, that it is part of the healing work that I want to do in the world. And you know I try to go at a slower pace, waking up in the mornings, journaling and reading before I start working, trying to set boundaries even around the actual writing process is so hard, but I try to do it. I lead a lot of writing workshops where we set like 20-minute timers and you just write for 20 minutes. And then we come back together and we ask how we're doing, and helping other people see writing as a spiritual practice, so that also just so that some of the pressure is off. Because if we show up with that pressure to be a good writer, to be a good storyteller, to make an award-winning book that everyone's going to love, we are going to get caught up in that, and then it's going to feel exhausting and unattainable. Um, if we show up coming to the surface from that deep river that we've been in, that we've been living in, that's where the medicine is. And then it could still be an award-winning book, but we also did it from the depths of who we are. We brought what was sacred about our work with us. So if you need to ritualize your writing, then do that. You know, make it like brew the same cup of tea every time you write, or I burn my sage a lot of times when I write, or I have like altars, you know, like the acorns, like that's special to me. So having these like near me to remind me of who I am. Even my wall behind me, like all of these are words or images that have meant something to me, and they surround me. Poetry and notes that people have left me and pictures, like all of it reminds me of who I am. So creating our space where we write, filling it with the things that remind us of who we are and why we do this work is incredibly important. I think it is so, so important for us to do.
As you think about your long arc as a writer and author, I want to go return, and this is the kind of final question before we turn to the audience, is you gave us this image of the oak tree. So seed, sapling, you have a full grown tree, you have a full body of work, and then you talk about how it nourishes that next generation. And I think I can intuit some like ways in which you've already invited us in to think about that as a sacred practice, as it seeding a flourishing future for the reading as a relationship with the audience who is, you know, it can transform a life. As you think about your own legacy as an author, as a writer who probably has a library left to write for us, which would be a gift. You know, what is it that you are now, as you have everything as stories out in the world? What's the next seed that you're dropping? What's the next story that you're getting ready to tell or share with us?
Mm. Is that a way of asking what my next book might be about?
That was the that was my attempt at being poetic of asking, you know, what's the next book title?
Oh, very creative. Yes, well, I do I do know the next book I'll write. I think something that's on the horizon for me or that I'm diving just deeper into is the connection between deeper into connection with Mother Earth with Sigma that will be always a part of my writing moving forward, I think, and also like connecting indigenous, as in Potawatomi, Anishinaabe kind of spirituality language with Celtic spirituality. Those are both really important to me, and there's so many threads between them that are really beautifully woven. And I want to lean deeper into some of those stories and or just cultural stories in general and how they intersect in the world. We have so much to share with each other, and to do it in ways that aren't appropriating or taking over or taking from one another, but in ways that are so collaborative and beautiful. And I think that that's probably something that the world will continue to need in the coming years, is reminders that we hold so much with one another across whatever divides we think we've created, that we also hold a lot of that sacred storytelling um, across all those boundaries with one another. So that'll be an element to some of my future work.
Mm, I love that. So what we're going to do now is we'll take questions from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and say thank you for everyone who's coming because I'll pause the recording. But I'm grateful for this conversation, Kaitlin. You've given me so much to think about, and the intention and responsibility that comes with being a storyteller. And I just want to thank you for the ways that you model that for so many of us as an author, as someone who's navigating both in and putting yourself out there very publicly around what type of stories heal. And just want to say thank you for being a storyteller and a healer. Um, thank you for all the stuff and the children's books. People need to get them. So those I love reading them. No, my Carmelita. I just gotta say that too.
Good.
All right, I'm gonna pause.